So it's about 4:30 in the morning right now, unable to sleep. So let's talk about the linguistic geography of East Asia. So remember, this is all from my head. If I have any errors, if I forget any language families, just remind me. Okay. But anyways, so an extremely common misconception is that in East Asia, everything is related to Chinese. That Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, possibly even Thai are all related. That is completely untrue. Um, so, Mongolian is not related to Chinese either. So basically, here's how it works. I'll probably make a video dissecting the Chinese language family at some point, but there are hundreds of Chinese languages. From, for example, Daejiwoi to Cantonese to Hakka to Weizhounese, the Shanghainese, Mandarin, a whole bunch. There's a very, very big host of Chinese languages. But the Chinese languages are actually part of a larger language family called the Sino-Tibetan language family. And what happens with the Sino-Tibetan languages is basically there's two main branches. One is the Chinese side, and the other side is like the Tibetan side. Well, the Burmo-Tibetan side, something like that. Anyways, many of the languages of Nepal, which are not Indo-European, because Nepal has a lot of Indo-European languages, but most of the languages of Nepal, many of the languages of Nepal, Bhutan, minority languages in Tibet, many languages within Burma, that little triangle part of India that's northeast of Bangladesh, Myanmar, Burmese is a Sino-Tibetan language. All of those languages are part of like a Tibeto-Burman branch. And then the Sinitic languages are all like, the things that Chinese people speak. Actually, it's kind of odd, but there's a lot of diglossia in China. So in a lot of ethnic Chinese communities known as Huaqiao or overseas Chinese, there's like Chinese people in Vietnam, Chinese people in Indonesia. The ones that can still speak their languages usually speak some kind of amalgamation of Teochew or Cantonese or Hakka or sometimes Hokkien. Hokkien and Teochew are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. And there's also, but basically what happens in most of China is there's this kind of like there's this idea of 外地人 and 本地人. I think it's 本地人 or 道地人, something like that. Anyways, the general idea is that people who come from a place learn a certain language. So, for example, Guangzhou, if you don't know Cantonese, or if you grow up in Guangzhou, the majority of people who grow up in Guangzhou will know Cantonese. And so most people who grow up in Guangzhou, what happens is they'll go to school in Mandarin, they'll have to talk Mandarin to their teachers, but because so many of their classmates speak Cantonese, they will end up learning Cantonese as well. And then sometimes they might speak another dialect. Like I met a guy, his family was from the Chaoshan area who speak the same dialect as me, even though I speak it badly, but anyways. So they speak like the same dialect as my family. But he grew up in Guangzhou, so he learned Cantonese, Mandarin, and Dijiu, and then he went on and learned English and whatever shit. But yeah. So basically, yes, you only ever really hear about two Chinese languages, but there are hundreds. I'm telling you, there are a lot. Most of them live in diglossic situations. The major cities of China, such as Beijing and Shanghai, are losing their dialects because so many people, so many 外地人 come to the city and they're not 本地人, and the 本地人 keep on talking their dialects, but the 外地人 never learn the dialect. Now, that isn't the case sometimes in certain cities which do not have a high migrant population. Anyways, I digress. We're talking about linguistic geography. I love sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is like beautiful. Like it's wonderful. Anyways, so generally in the East Asia-ish region, Australia is in a whole nother beast. Completely unrelated. Completely. But so I'm gonna ignore Siberia for now because I need to review Siberia. But Japanese and Okinawan are part of a language family called the Japonic languages. Korean, it could be debated that an archaic form of the Jeju dialect of Korean is another language because it's very hard for people who speak only standard Korean to understand it, but it's dying, just like Okinawan. But that's the Koreanic language family. There are many theories that Koreanic and Japonic languages are related, but it's not been proven and there's no consensus about it. Then you have, well, we had talked about the Tibetan languages. There's the Mongolic languages, which are, for example, Mongolian, Oirat. Actually, there's a lot of them. There's a good video about it on Native Lang. So I mean, you can go there and look it up. It's actually the last video. But yeah. So if you want to learn about that, then there's a lot of languages there. Or just plain old fucking Wikipedia. Manchurian is, I believe, a Tungusic language. There's a couple other languages too, like Evansky or whatever. A lot of minority languages in Russia are Tungusic languages. The Tungusic languages are heavily endangered. Basically, what happened with Manchurian is that a couple of centuries ago, it actually had a pretty decent pool of speakers. I mean, there's 10 million ethnic Manchurians, but there's only like a couple hundred, or debatably a couple thousand, depending. Because there's also like this dialect of it's sometimes considered a dialect, sometimes not considered a dialect, but there's like 40,000 or 30,000 speakers of a language over in the Xinjiang region of China, and that language is like the modern equivalent of Manchurian because all other dialects of Manchurian are like almost dead. If you go to Dongbei, there's a couple people who still speak it, but it's around like 70. Natively at least. There's learners, but most of them have to go to the desert to learn it. or that place over in Xinjiang. I can't remember what the dialect is called, but anyways, they're like descendants of people who went and when the Manchurians moved into China and created the Qing dynasty, some of the people were sent to that region and they were just never retrieved, never came back, and they kept their culture a lot better than the ones in the capital. But a lot of the Manchurians, basically due to like 300 years of contact with Chinese speaking people in the north of China, middle class people started losing their language, and then basically what happened was everyone except for very poor villagers and the very richest of the rich, namely the court, forgot everything. But by the time of like Puyi, within that last century, it was dying very, very, very much in the royal family, and it survived in a couple of villages far to the east in Dongbei, in that region, Dongbei, Jilin, that area. But anyways, that's the most famous of the Tungusic languages. Yeah. I am on so many tangents. Fuck. Anyways, so you have the Tungusic languages, which are close to the Mongolic languages, which kind of borders on the Siberian languages. Siberian languages are an interesting thing to talk about some other time. Many targeted languages in Siberian, but there's also a couple other language families that are native to that region. Anyways, so you have Sino-Tibetan, you have Mongolic, you have Koreanic, you have Japanese, or Japonic. The indigenous languages of Taiwan are called Formosan languages, and they are the progenitors, you could say, of the Austronesian languages. The Austronesian language family is an extremely large language family, and it is very wide and extremely diverse. Basically, the Austronesian language family consists of the languages of Formosa, so the indigenous languages of Taiwan, the indigenous languages, well, basically what you would now consider indigenous languages of the Philippines. But there's also basically what happened was that several thousand years ago, like originally the Philippines had an original group of people, and they were the original settlers, and they spoke a different language group, and they did a study, and you can see it because they're like the Negrito Filipinos and the Negrito Filipinos have their own Filipino languages, and they have a substratum of the languages that were originally in the Philippines prior to the Austronesian invasion, like 60,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, whatever it is. But they have like that thing. But basically what happened is the Austronesian languages developed in Formosa. They moved down to the Philippines, brought it to the Philippines, and then they moved down even further, and they moved down across all of Indonesia. They moved down across all of Oceania. Maori is an Austronesian language. Hawaiian is an Austronesian language. Rapa Nui, all the languages of like Tuvalu and Fiji, Javan, all the minority languages within Indonesia. Indonesian is an Austronesian language. Malagasy from Madagascar is an Austronesian language. Surprisingly, though, the language of the Maldives is an Indo-European language. So it's kind of like Madagascar, Indo-European, and then the rest is like... Australia is a big exception. most of Papua New Guinea is another exception. Papua New Guinea is extremely complicated, one of the most linguistically dense places in the entire world. And there's like a couple different numbers, but by the SIL, basically there's the SIL is basically an institute that basically it's like a encyclopedia of all the world's languages, and there are technically like 800 and something languages in Papua New Guinea, and that's not including the other side of the island, just the one side. And so there's a lot of languages on that island. It's because of all the mountain valleys and all the tribes and stuff. But if you look, the definition of language is a very, very fluctuating, very fluid. So, for example, in India, they constantly cite that they have more than 1,000 languages. But what happens is the definition of a language is extremely different in India. Because a lot of people there's a lot of names for the same language. Yeah. But that could be controversial, I know. But yeah. What other languages? Oh, Mang Khmer and Tai Kai. So we have the Austronesian languages, which are Maori, Indonesian, and it has like 1,500 languages. That's a shit ton. There's a lot of languages stretching from Madagascar all the way to Easter Island. The indigenous language of Easter Island is Rapa Nui. And then you have the Japonic languages, you have the Mongolic languages, Linguistic languages, Sino-Tibetan languages, as well as the Koreanic languages. Well, language. It's considered a language isolate, but you could debate. Vietnamese is the largest and perhaps one of the, at least phonetically, one of the most divergent Mon Khmer languages. It's also called Austroasiatic. Different names for the same shit. Papua New Guinea, completely different thing. I will not cover that in this. I need to honestly study that. But basically, the Mon Khmer languages, the only national languages that are Mon Khmer are Vietnamese and Khmer. But there's some indigenous languages of Malaysia, Hainan, parts of China, and many of the smaller tribal languages like Hmong within Laos and Vietnam and Khmer in Cambodia are all Mon Khmer. Or Austroasiatic, two names for the same shit. And then you have the Tai languages, Thai, Lao, and then various indigenous languages. Borders are porous in this area, so there's some Tai languages in like Burma and some in Laos, minority languages in Cambodia and Vietnam, as well as Malaysia, some other areas too. But the most big one is Thai and Lao. So yeah, honestly, that's about it. I digress a lot, but ignoring the languages of Papua New Guinea and the languages of Siberia. Oh, I forgot about Ainu. Ainu is a language isolate, but that's when you start getting into Siberia. I'm not going to talk about Nifri either. That's another language isolate, but that's on the Kuril Islands, I believe. It's somewhere over there. Siberia. Siberia is very linguistically diverse. Something I will cover some other time. But basically, Sino-Tibetan languages, Chinese, Burmese, Tibetan, and many others. Cantonese, all of the different Chinese languages. Austronesian languages, the indigenous languages of Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Madagascar, pretty much all of Oceania, all of the Polynesians and the Melanesians as well, for the most part. Japanese is in the Japonic language family. Korean is in the Koreanic language family. Mongolian is in the Mongolic language family, along with many other ethnic minority languages. Manchurian is in the Tungusic language family. Oh, I think it might be called the Venka. Manchurian and Venka or something like that. Then you have Vietnamese, large, and Khmer, which are the only two federal level languages that are in the Khmer languages. And then you have the Tai languages, which is Thai and Lao. So that's the whole like East Asia, Southeast Asia region. But honestly, a lot of people say, "Oh, they're all Chinese." No, just no. Here's honestly how it worked. Thai has lots of influences from Sanskrit and shit from out that way. And some from China as well, but not as much. Vietnam was very Sinicized. Japan, very Sinicized. Korea, very Sinicized. But Sinicized with old languages. The different dialects, which have been the most powerful dialects, have changed with every single dynasty. Mandarin just happens to be the big one right now. In other eras, it was other dialects. But, yeah. So, bye.